It was a long time coming, this appearance. Of course, it had been talked about, and we know that Dr. Stock had previously lost her job and all manner of other things she had to deal with. But she turned up and it happened, but it didn't happen, of course, without the protesters there. Some might say, well, that's democracy in action, fair enough. But nonetheless, it's still, the protest was still determined to frame this woman as a hate figure, essentially.
It is just remarkable that a philosopher, an academic, as it happens, a very mild-mannered woman,
Yep.
Kathleen Stock, saying extremely normal things, as you mentioned in your introduction, like people who have male bodies, i.e. men, shouldn't be allowed to come into places where women are getting naked or going to sleep or, you know, being vulnerable, like prisons or changing rooms or whatever, is met with such outrage. It's just quite, when you sort of zoom out from the whole thing and think about what is actually going on, it's almost laughable if it wasn't so tragic. And you have to, you know, we have to say that this is happening at Oxford University, which is meant to be, you know, along with Cambridge, the place that we're all told is the sort of the seats of knowledge, the most important places in the country academically, where the thinkers and movers and shakers of the, you know, next generation are being taught and being shaped, and that it's happening here, and such sort of philistinism is happening outside this talk is rather worrying. I think the thing that I think is most problematic is a word that other people use, is such a terrible word, but is really most problematic, is the fact that this protester Riz, who sat and glued himself, whatever, to the floor, was wearing a T-shirt that said "No more dead trans kids," insinuating that Kathleen Stock in some way was the consequences of what she was doing, talking about gender and talking about women's rights and all the rest of it, was somehow leading to the loss of life among trans children. That is an outrageous claim. And it's also the kind of weaponization of suicide or death or harm in this way to silence a particular voice is just the most toxic kind of affront to free speech. And I think really we should be pushing back on that as hard as we can.
Yeah, I would just factor into that, Ella, that when I look at the myriad videos of men with big bushy beards and very deep voices and clearly a political agenda sitting on social media saying, I'm a woman and I'm as much a woman as any other woman, I would argue that group of people would be more responsible for the difficulties suffered by young trans kids than anything Kathleen Stock has ever done.
Well, it's just really important to note that actually Kathleen Stock doesn't very often talk about. Well, actually, she says herself she's got no interest in limiting how people express themselves, limiting how what people call themselves, or in fact, probably like most of the rest of us, and now I'm sort of speaking for myself, have very little interest and sick to the back teeth of talking about trans expression and how people want to be called and what pronouns they want to be used and all the rest of it. It's just the most boring subject in the world, you know, talking about how people feel internally and being expected to kind of dance to their tune. I'm really sick of it. Mostly what she talks about is how the take-up of this narrative, that how you feel inside should direct how society views you, has changed the way women interact in the world, the way women are able to access spaces, like I've already mentioned, whether it's rape crisis centres or able to compete in sports or are able to define themselves, to talk about themselves, you know, as mothers or as women and, you know, all the rest of it. And so it's I think one of the most infuriating things about this is that it often, when it comes to Dr. Kathleen Stock, the narrative is dominated by a question of what she's saying about trans people or what she's saying about trans kids. She's actually not talking about them, she's talking about women. Yeah. And I think that probably tells you something about the nature of the whole debate, that what is effectively having a dire effect on women's ability to talk about themselves. It's constantly being silenced, and the debate is dominated by a question of whether or not your view on gender is killing trans kids, and that's pretty...
Just very quickly, Ella, because we are short of time, but what the underpinning of what I sense these people are arguing is that people like Kathleen Stock are no different to the racists and the homophobes who don't like gay people or black people. This is exactly the same thing. I mean, demonstrably it isn't, but that seems to be their contention.
And this is what happens when you open the door to censorship, particularly on campus, because unfortunately, the attempted banning and silencing of Kathleen Stock follows on from a long and illustrious history on UK universities of no platform policies and zero tolerance policies, and lots of different ways in which free speech is hampered or limited or squeezed. And you know what began in the sort of 30, 40 years ago as policies that were about limiting actual card carrying fascists from speaking on campus has now, the slippery slope argument is a bit of a dodgy one, but it has led to where we are at the moment, where women are being stopped from speaking on campus for talking about what it means to be a woman. So, I urge people to back free speech at university with no ifs and no buts. That's the only way that you can defend not just the people that you agree with and their ability to speak, but everyone's ability to speak freely. In fact, that woman, that individual, however they identify, who glued themselves to the floor, would have done better than doing that silently and tweeting, to actually get in the audience, stand up and ask Kathleen a question, which I'm sure she would have answered.
Absolutely spot on.